I want to thank Gail for that introduction. You know, when you're a speaker, you sometimes get a little anxious and nervous about how they're going to introduce you. And I guess my scars from such an introduction go back to when I was in my late teens. When I was a teenager, I was diagnosed with a rare form of cancer, and the American Cancer Society at the national office had heard about my story, and they had heard me speak once to a group of volunteers. And so in a sense, they made me one of their poster children, and they asked me to join a speakers bureau flying all over the country and to speak to American Cancer Society volunteers. And while I wasn't compensated for it, they allowed me to bring a guest. And so one of the trips, I invited one of my brothers to join me. And on the flight there, I said, Mike, you know, so often they just kind of give you this staged introduction. It might be nice, since you were with me during this battle, if you would introduce me and make it a little more personal. And he said, I'd be honored to. So the evening rolls around, and Mike gets up to introduce me, and he says, ladies and gentlemen, Will Rogers once said he never met a man he didn't like. And he paused and went on to say, well, he obviously never met my brother. So needless to say, I preferred the canned introductions, just read it off the bio, and you will find no members of the McHale family in this room today. But I want to thank you for giving me an opportunity to just kind of share a little bit and reflect on my own journey and what I have learned. First, people have asked, why does the Kellogg Foundation see something as racial equity as something that's so important? And I would submit it really goes back to the man who made it all possible, Will Keith Kellogg, who in 1935, after the foundation had been established for 5 years, wrote in a letter very simply, do with it as you please, as long as it benefits the health, happiness, and well-being of children. Now, he didn't say white children. He didn't name specific types of children. He said children. And as the stewards of Mr. Kellogg's resources, if we really want to honor his intent of trying to make sure that all kids are healthy, happy, and have well-being, then we've got to deal with these issues of racial equity. Because too many, and disproportionately it's our children of color, who are being left behind and aren't benefiting from that. At the Kellogg Foundation, we see racial equity as all about respecting one another, but for us it's really about being true to our values, our beliefs, and our mission of creating conditions. We're not interested in creating programs. We want to create conditions to propel vulnerable children to success. And while Kellogg may be more recognized in the last decade or so in this space, I would offer to you that we've really been on this journey for well over 30 years. It started with our chairman and CEO, Russ Mobby, who first realized we have to take care of our own backyard before we can start doing things externally. So he identified the need to start diversifying his board, both in gender and in race. And the first woman added to the board is a member here, Dottie Johnson, who served on the Kellogg Foundation board for 32 years. We then realized we needed to start diversifying our staff. And so we took what was a predominantly white staff and started adding people of color in the roles of officer, program directors, mid-level managers. We then started developing a number of initiatives focused on specific populations and sectors, such as our tremendous work that we've done in the past around historically black colleges and universities, Native American higher education efforts, Hispanic serving institutions, looking at ways to increase the number of Latino boys and girls go on to college, our African American Men and Boys Initiative, our Michigan Community Foundation Youth Project, which in a way was a stealth way to try to diversify the boards and the staff of community foundations to start talking about some of the issues around race and vulnerable kids. All of this was really good work, and I would submit we had some admirable outcomes. But to be honest with you, as we reflect on it, it really wasn't good enough. It wasn't deep enough, and it wasn't systemic enough. Why is that? Because we really weren't having the right conversations, the tough conversations, the honest conversations. Now, I would submit some of our staff were having those honest conversations, but of course they were in the confines of their own office behind closed doors. And there were a couple trustees who I'm sure were having those conversations, but we just weren't having them in the places that they needed to be held. So it was just over 10 years ago that we as a foundation really started creating the space and developed the courage to talk about why is it that our children of color are being disproportionately being left behind. We also created some space that led to our initial work in this area that led to our capitalizing on diversity work. And then we granted the permission and created the space and the courage to talk about structural racism, institutional racism, internalized racism, racial equity, racial healing, unconscious bias, and then white privilege. Whoa. Now, wait a minute here. I was doing just fine up to this point. And then we're talking about white privilege. And I'm thinking, stop this bus. It's getting personal. I mean, I certainly knew what white privilege was. I mean, white privilege to me was being a 52-year-old white male, being 25 pounds overweight, bald, and being able to walk down the street and still think I'm sexy. And my daughters helped me kind of get an understanding of it when they gave me a birthday card last year and the cover said, "The Lord moves in mysterious ways." And you open it up, it said, "Just like white guys on the dance floor." But I think the best example and the best story that helped me better understand the concept of white privilege was through the story of an older fish who one morning was swimming by two younger fish. And they swam by each other, and the older fish said to the two younger fish, "Good morning, boys. How's the water?" And the one younger fish looks at the other younger fish and says, "Water? What the hell's water?" Well, the point of this story, which was told by the late David Wallace, is merely that the most obvious and important realities are often the ones that are hardest to see and to talk about. The water of whites, and I would submit even more so for white males, is our privilege of being white and the unconscious part of being white. I mean, when I reflect on my own life, I'm embarrassed to say, but I graduated from college 30 years ago. I've never once had to apply for a job. Whenever I received a promotion, and I've been blessed to have many, no one ever questioned my promotion because of the color of my skin. I have never been followed in a store because people thought I might shoplift or steal something merely because of the color of my skin. I have never been denied a mortgage because of where I chose to live. I've never had to be concerned about being adequately represented by elected officials. I've never had to worry about my children and the quality of school they'll have the opportunity to attend. I've never had the opportunity or the challenge or the fear of where I'm going to be seated in a restaurant with the fear of my back to the door, as so many of my African American friends have explained to me. So having these privileges is so easy and automatic that it really doesn't have to be a choice. It's just the automatic and unconscious belief that everyone must live that way. But it's important that we start becoming aware and thinking in different ways. And this is not easy. And some of you had the privilege of hearing from Sally Lederman earlier, and you're going to hear from her yet this afternoon, who I often like to quote when she said, "We swim in a sea of white privilege every day. It is invisible to those of us who have it and boldly apparent to those who do not. It is systemic, yet enacted at an individual level. When it does become visible, it can feel like taking a solid hit in the gut, the floor dropping away from your feet, and many other experiences that one feels the enormity of the negative impact when our actions are dropped squarely in our laps." Amen. Can I get an amen? Amen. I love doing that. But I want you to understand, there really is a role for all of us in the work. Throughout this day, I'm sure you've heard some of your panelists refer to the need to focus on our hearts and on our heads. The head being the part of the complexities of structural racism, inequities, and white privilege. The heart, by hearing stories from and building relationships with people who come from different ethnicities, including whites. But I would submit we also need to focus on our hands. How can we use the knowledge and awareness that you're going to be taking away from today's meetings and start working on racial equity and awareness in your own organizations and in your communities? This is really hard work, but it takes will and effort and time. as a vice president of the W.K. Kellogg Foundation, I know for the various teams that I lead, that if I want us to be effective as an organization and for my teams in this area, I need to start with my own personal journey. And I need to allow them the time and the space to work on this with me and with each other. And I understand that I need allies of color who, when I do slip, they're there to catch me, pick me up, and coach me, and be there when I have those difficult questions. And when we can do that, then we can be better in communities with our grantees and with one another as we all work on these personal journeys. Now, I don't pretend to stand here and be that old fish. I mean, shoot, I still do think I'm sexy. And regardless of what my daughters say, I really do know how to Dougie. But there is no perfect time or set of conditions to start this work. The time is now. So as an institution of the Kellogg Foundation, and any organization is merely a consequence of the people who comprise it, we as individuals are with you in this journey. A journey where there's a lot of challenges, a journey where we're going to make mistakes, and trust me, you will make mistakes. And so while this is hard and sometimes scary work and at times very lonely work, let me close my comments with some words of prayer that were taught to me by a very dear friend and mentor. And I start every day with these, and it goes something like this. For I'm only one, but I am one. I can't do everything, but I can do something. And what I can do, I ought to do. And what I ought to do, by the grace of God, I will do. For I am only one, but I am one. And I submit to you that if each of you do what we can do and what you ought to do, we can indeed start dismantling all forms of racism in our communities and our nation and our states. And as we state every time we say our Pledge of Allegiance, we can be one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you, and I wish you Godspeed.